The Denver Broncos practice squad is set. What were some of the biggest surprises, and who could be the biggest impact player on the practice squad this upcoming season? Plus, what are the rules pertaining to the practice squad? I know Broncos Country wants to know, and we're going to get to that on today's brand new episode, Locked on Broncos.
You are Locked on Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked on Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What's up, Broncos Country? Welcome into a brand new episode, Locked on Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast, part of the Locked on Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you so much to everybody in Broncos Country for tuning in and making Locked on Broncos your first listen of the day every single day. Free and available everywhere you get your podcasts or whether you watch us on YouTube. Thank you so much. From the South Stands to the end zone, I'm your host, as always, Cody Roark, Broncos beat reporter for Mile High Sports, joined alongside by my co-host, Sayre Bedinger. He's the site expert, predominantly orange.com. Sayre, my friend, the practice squad is set. The Broncos have now transitioned into regular season mode as it pertains to practice and the access we get, a 20-minute viewing period for this Broncos team at practice now. We're just here. We're just literally a week and a half away from the season kicking off, man. I'm stoked about it. But you know what? Let's talk about the practice squad because I think there were some surprises there initially. And not to mention, which players on the practice squad do we feel like could have the bigger impact this upcoming season? Can't wait to break it down with you and everybody here in Broncos Country.
Excited to talk about it, Cody. Excited to have a lot of these players back in the fold. We had talked as the rosters were being cut down to 53. A lot of these guys will be back. I mean, the Broncos had to make 27 roster moves in order to get down to 53 players. Obviously, we knew that wouldn't be the end of the roster reshuffling that George Paton and company would be doing. So for now, it looks like 13 players being brought back onto the practice squad. We'll kind of see what happens in the coming days. The biggest surprises to me, Cody, there were three actually. Netane Muti, I didn't think he would make it through waivers, but the Broncos were able to get him back. He was competing for a starting job earlier this offseason, so the Broncos able to get Netane Muti, a 2020 sixth rounder, back into the fold. But he wasn't the only 2020 draft pick they were able to get back in the fold. McTelvin Agim, the defensive lineman, is back on the practice squad. I think that's a surprise to a lot of people, right? Because he had that big game against the Vikings. I think a lot of people thought maybe he has some trade value now, or maybe he'll get claimed by another team on waivers if the Broncos let him go. They were able to get him back. And the third surprise to me, Cody, Kendall Hinton, the wide receiver. The Broncos able to bring Kendall Hinton back. I personally felt like Kendall Hinton might take an opportunity elsewhere. It's just the message being sent, hey, we have 6 other guys that we're going to utilize right away. You're not necessarily one of them right now, but maybe there is a role for Kendall Hinton. Maybe I was overlooking some things there a little bit. Maybe Kendall Hinton will get called up to the active roster here early in the season. We'll see. But Kendall Hinton, McTelvin Agim, Netane Muti, those are my 3 biggest surprises to be brought back onto the practice squad this year.
And for the most part, most of the Broncos that were released were brought back onto the practice squad, with the exception Seth Williams was entertaining offers from some other NFL teams. Tight end Dylan Parham is also another player who received some offers from other teams, but he decided he wanted to stay in Denver. So that is a little bit of a surprise to me. But I would say my surprise is more procedural in a sense. Denver, they have a 16-player practice squad. They only signed 13 players to the practice squad on Wednesday, which to me I think was a little surprising, which this kind of tells me, Sayre, and this is what I think it means. They're looking at other waiver wires, possibly in the next couple of weeks here to maybe add more players to it, right? And I think that's a smart move there. Also, what does it mean for Brandon Johnson and the injury settlement? I think that's something we're going to have to wait and see how things go, but maybe they're saving a spot for him as one of those guys. Outside of that, there would be 2 open spots, and could Denver maybe look at adding a cornerback or something on the practice squad, which I think would be very interesting. I think that's something that they need to do. I know you and I are in agreement on that when we talk about the Broncos cornerback depth there. It was good to see Faion Hicks brought back onto the practice squad, and even Jaquan McMillan was able to make it back there as well. But could there be another player out there? I've heard Tay Gowan's name thrown out there as someone that Broncos country would like to potentially see. We're just going to have to wait and see at this point in time. But also some other roster moves that did happen on Wednesday for this Broncos football team. George Paton, as he said, did place Michael Ojemudia and Greg Dulcich on the short-term injured reserve list And those 2 roster spots that those guys would have made up on the 53 now go to Mike Purcell and Eric Tomlinson, who took one for the team on Tuesday during roster cuts. So whenever those guys are ready to come back after that week 4 kind of stint there heading into week 5, it'll be very interesting to see what moves the Broncos make and maybe who they offset and release just so those guys can come back up onto the active roster. But Broncos country coming up here in just a moment. Sayre and I are going to play a little game. We're going to discuss which players we believe that are on the practice squad right now that can have the biggest impact on this Broncos football team coming up here in the 2022 NFL season. But before we do that, let me tell you about Elias, the sponsor of today's episode, Locked On Broncos. It's almost the start of the NFL season, and I love this time of the year. Sayre loves this time of the year, and I guarantee you love this time of the year. And if you're into sports betting or fantasy, you need a competitive edge to win. That's why I highly recommend the Elias Game Plan app. It's the ultimate sports betting and fantasy companion for the NFL, NBA, and MLB. And Elias Game Plan is the only sports app with the most trusted name in sports stats. The Elias Sports Bureau, the official statisticians of U.S. pro sports leagues, including the NFL. And their app lets you access team and player stats, head-to-head comparisons of teams, and Elias insights from the Elias Sports Bureau research team. This app is really your one-stop source for player news and league-validated player stats and team records, expert game analysis for betting, building your fantasy team, impressing friends. The NFL season is right around the corner, so don't wait. Download the Elias Game Plan app today, and right now I have a special offer when you subscribe. You can get a 14-day free trial off a monthly subscription plan, but only if you use my promo code Locked On NFL. That's all together, one word, Locked On NFL. Find Elias Game Plan Sports Betting in the App Store or Play Store today and use my promo code Locked On NFL. Which Broncos practice squad member could have the biggest impact on offense or defense this upcoming season? Broncos country, make sure you chime in along here on the Locked On Broncos podcast. Tweet us on Twitter at Cody Roark NFL, at Sayre Bedinger, at Locked On Broncos, or if you're watching us on YouTube, engage in the comment section down below. Let us know which practice squad player you think will have the biggest impact this upcoming season. Thank you so much, Broncos country, making Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day every single day, free and available everywhere you get your podcasts or whether you watch on YouTube. We appreciate you so much. All right, Sayre, let's get into this, my man. I'm excited about this now. Obviously, a 13-player practice squad right now for this Broncos football team. There's a multitude of different players on it, but I feel like this is good that we kind of have different names here, right? And I think it's good when we look at the grand scheme of offense or defense. Which player do you believe that is on the Denver Broncos practice squad right now can have the biggest impact on offense or defense this upcoming season?
Well, Cody, I'm going to go with defense, and I'm going to say rookie 7th-round pick Faion Hicks, the defensive back out of Wisconsin. You know, maybe not a lot of people saw in the preseason necessarily what they wanted to see from the defensive backs, myself included. I will admit, Cody, I wasn't overly impressed with the cornerbacks this preseason for the Broncos. But you know what? Assistant GM Darren Muji, he talked to the media along with George Payton, and he mentioned, you know, getting rid of Faion Hicks or cutting him for even a day was a hard move for the team to make. So the Broncos are obviously high on him. They're high on this rookie class. They're high on the 2022 draft class, which is awesome to see almost every single one of them making this 53-man roster despite not having a pick until number 64 overall. But Faion Hicks is a guy that I think at a thin position on this roster. You mentioned it in the previous segment. We want to see the Broncos maybe add some at the cornerback position. I think Faion Hicks is a guy that at some point this year, he's going to get a chance to go out there. And what I think is important for the listeners to know, and even myself to be reminded of, what these players looked like in the preseason is not necessarily indicative of how they would look if Faion Hicks was out there, say, as the other cornerback opposite Pat Surtain the second, right? Things might look a little bit different with Justin Simmons communicating on the back end, or Kareem Jackson kind of playing that dime backer role next to you on the inside of you. Things like that, they can change a lot. Or with Bradley Chubb and Randy Gregory rushing the quarterback, making your job as a corner a lot easier. So I see Faion Hicks as being a very impactful player this season, potentially getting some reps out there. I know the Broncos like Damari Mathis as an outside corner as well, but wouldn't be surprised if Faion Hicks gets an opportunity at least to come up, play some special teams, make an impact in that regard as well.
Well, and I know that Christian Parker, the Broncos defensive backs coach, has loved working with all these guys. I mean, I'm a former DB coach, and I just thought, like, just all training camp, I was like, man, it'd be so fun to just kind of coach this group up, to work with this room, because you have like energetic personalities, but you also have super smart football minds. And I think these young guys, like the Faion Hicks, the Mari Mathises of the world, they're benefiting a lot from guys like Patrick Surtain, Ronald Darby, Justin Simmons, Kareem Jackson, some of the other guys, Kawan Williams, inside that Broncos locker room. And I tell you what, like, I think you nailed it perfectly with saying, like, these guys won't necessarily look how they looked in the preseason when they're thrown into a regular season situation. And you know what? The Broncos at some point this year, with any of these players that are on the practice squad, they could be a play or an injury away from being in this very role here. So I'm glad that you highlighted that, because I know you hit on things from a roster construction standpoint. And oftentimes, I think with fan bases, this sometimes gets overlooked. So I'm glad that you brought that up. Now, for me, when looking at this Broncos practice squad, who do I believe will be the biggest impact player on the practice squad that could help out in the regular season this upcoming season? I'm going to go the cliche route here. I'm going to go with the offensive side of the ball. I'm going to go with Kendall Hinton. And even like talking to Nathaniel Hackett on Wednesday for the press conference, just mentioning what it's like to get a guy like Hinton back. I mean, there was the belief amongst the coaches, like, hey, we didn't know if he was going to be able to come back here initially. And what was interesting enough is the Broncos didn't place any claim in on any player as well that was on the waiver wire from other teams, which was very interesting to say the least. But for Kendall Hinton, when you factor in this wide receiver room right now that has Cortland Sutton, Jerry Jeudy, KJ Hamler, you even go to Montreal Washington, Jalen Virgil, the undrafted guy, and Tyree Cleveland, who made the roster, in my opinion, one injury happens, or one guy gets banged up, that's going to be a call-up for a guy like Kendall Hinton. And you know what? I also wouldn't be surprised if he gets called up on game day, and we'll explain kind of the practice squad rules a little bit later on the show, because we had a listener of the show say, hey, can you explain what the practice squad rules are like and how they apply to the Broncos on game day? We'll dive into that a little bit later on the show, but Kendall Hinton, Sayre, I mean, what more do we have to say about what he's been able to do? Now, last year, he was kind of a little bit of an impact player, an underrated role, right? He was a chain mover for the Broncos when he was in. He caught a touchdown pass against the Pittsburgh Steelers early on in the season, and he's just continued to evolve as a route runner. And according to Coach Azzani, he's become a better blocker. Like, he's one of the Broncos' better blocking wide receivers because he's fundamental. He understands how to move laterally, get inside the frame. To me, I just think that with that, combined with Russell Wilson really liking Kendall Hinton this offseason, I think it's only a matter of time before we see Kendall Hinton brought up on the active roster and playing a little bit of an impact role on this Broncos offense, because we even talked about 7 wide receivers leading up to the whole roster cut thing, and now they have the opportunity to maybe do that in a sense with a guy like Kendall Hinton potentially being called up or elevated on a game day. So Kendall Hinton is my choice. Broncos country, we're eager for your thoughts down below. Who would be, in your opinion, a surprise, a contributor for you, someone who could be a big impact player? Sir, I think we can make an argument for one other guy. He plays defensive line. We mentioned him earlier, McTelvin Agim, right? Because of the fact that, hey, the Broncos' defensive line depth, George Payton said he felt pretty comfortable with it right now. And with Mike Purcell now being elevated because of the injured reserve moves, Denver now has 6 defensive linemen. You have Purcell, DJ Jones, Draymond Jones, and you have the rookies with Ioma Uwazurike and Matt Henningsen alongside Deshaun Williams. So your thoughts on maybe McTelvin Agim? Could he maybe become a big-time impact player from the practice squad?
Oh, absolutely. He could. I mean, the former 3rd-round pick, he's going to be hungry. I mean, you get put on the practice squad. I don't think it's necessarily a negative, but I think it's a wake-up call for sure. For a 3rd-round pick, a guy that you were a top 100 guy. The Broncos are expecting quite a bit from you. And not to mention, there was a real opportunity to kind of go out there and seize a starting job at the defensive end position opposite Draymond Jones this offseason, because DJ Jones is going to be playing in the middle there in the, the base formation, right? So definitely for McTelvin Agim, I think it's a wake-up call, Cody, and I think it's an opportunity. Maybe even in the Vikings game, we kind of just saw a little glimpse of maybe him just kind of coming out of his shell a little bit, maybe getting a little bit more comfortable. I don't know what it is with certain players. Maybe they're out there just thinking too much, or maybe the weight of kind of the future of what your roster position might hold weighs on you a little bit. It could be any number of things that has nothing to do with how good you are at the game of football, because we know McTelvin Agim, we saw against the Vikings. I mean, he's good. He's instinctive. He can play hard, and he can go out and make plays as a pass rusher. I just think now is the time, and this is going to put that chip on his shoulder. It's going to give him that drive. It's going to give him that fire. I would not be surprised at all if at some point he gets permanently called up to the 53 and he's in the rotation making a big impact.
I'm with you, and everybody loves Sosa. I mean, that obviously for him, the nickname continues on from his time at Arkansas, but man, I tell you what, very much needed big game from him against the Minnesota Vikings to close things out. And I don't know if he actually ever got credited for that strip sack that Baron Browning scooped and scored. I think they gave that to Baron, but if you go back and you watch the replay, clear as day, it's McTelvin Agim who comes in and knocks it out of Sean Mannion's hands, but that was a big moment. I'm excited about the Broncos' defensive depth. I think from the front seven to the linebackers to outside backers to the secondary, I think there's a lot of optimism in the air about what this unit can be here in 2022. But Broncos country coming up here in just a moment. You hear practice squad, you hear about the rules, you hear about players being signed there, you hear about players being called up, but what does it actually mean? We dive into the practice squad rules that Broncos country and most NFL fans should get to know if they don't know already. We get to that coming up here in just a moment, but before we do that, let me tell you about an important message about driving sober. And are you one of those people who thinks it's okay to drive stoned? What's the worst that can happen? You end up driving below the speed limit? It's no big deal, right? Wrong. The truth is your reaction times slow way down when you're high, and you not only put yourself in danger, but everyone around you. Stop kidding yourself. It's not okay to drive high. If you've been using marijuana in any form, do not get behind the wheel. And if you feel different, you drive different. Drive high, get a DUI. What are the rules of NFL practice squads, and how might it apply or change on game days when we talk about elevations, different positions? Well, you're going to get that coming up here in just a moment. Just want to say thank you so much, Broncos country, for tuning in, making Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day. Whether you listen to our favorite audio podcasting platform or whether you watch us here on YouTube, thank you so much, Broncos country. All right, Sayre, we had a listener of the show tweet us earlier on Wednesday and say, hey, can you kind of explain the practice squad rules? And I think this is great because I actually don't know how many shows actually explain the rules of the practice squad. We just hear it all the time. This player was signed to the practice squad. This player's elevated. This player was released. What does that subsequently mean? So let's go into it right now. And obviously we all know that the active roster, teams are allowed 53 players on the active roster every single season. And now with the new CBA, there's a brand new 16-player practice squad that allows you to keep several impact players, not to mention vested veterans, which I think accounts for players who've played 4+ years in the National Football League. Those guys are considered vested veterans. What are some other rules that maybe Broncos fans or other NFL fans need to know about the practice squad and how it maybe fluctuates?
Well, so we know that every team gets a 53-man active roster, right? But the practice squad fluctuates year to year. I think it used to be as low as 8 players, Cody, if memory serves me correct, which thinking in hindsight, like how crazy is that the NFL ever implemented that rule? It's now 16 players. This is something they changed during the pandemic, the first year of the pandemic, right? When everything was kind of crazy and you didn't know week to week, who's going to be on the COVID list, who are you, how many guys are you going to need help from? They really kept this rule in place, and I couldn't be happier about it, Cody, because I think it's perfect for the NFL. There's no true developmental league in the NFL, but this allows you, yes, you are allowed veterans on the practice squad, and we'll get to that in a second here. But to me, having a 16-player practice squad is almost better than having a developmental league, because now every team has 16 guys that they're getting the same coaching. They're in the positional meetings. They're out there on the field with the best of the best, right? So 16 players on the practice squad is the maximum, which you alluded to earlier. The Broncos only keeping 13. A little bit of a surprise, but at the same time, maybe they are looking for some guys from the outside. And to me, Cody, this is the best and biggest rule that they have, is the 16 players. Every team needs this desperately. There's so many injuries in the league. So having 16 players for the Broncos, for every other team, is absolutely key. And there's something else that I think is new this year as well. They did this for fewer guys last year, but protecting players on the practice squad. So you don't just have these guys getting poached every single week. You can actually protect players on your practice squad.
Well, and that's huge, because I think that sometimes you do see it, like if anyone's ever played Madden as well, like sometimes you get a practice squad player and they get poached by another team. Like, wait, I didn't even have a say in that. So if you don't protect them, another NFL team that does need it, they could come in and poach, which is always interesting because it's almost like the player doesn't really have a say. Like, They could be on Denver one week. Oh, hey, you're going to Seattle this week. Could you imagine being a player and having that kind of situation happen to you? Or like Jacksonville, or like the worst team in the NFL, whichever it may be. It could be the Atlanta Falcons. It could be the Chicago Bears this year. That would suck. But also one thing, too, you can shuttle 2 players per week, and each player can be shuttled 3 times. So what does that mean, Sayre, when a player can be shuttled? Is this the transition for where they get called up on the active game day roster, even though they're on the practice squad, and then shuttled back to the practice squad without being waived?
Yes, exactly. So that can happen 3 times for every player on your practice squad. So let's just use Kendall Hinton as an example. Let's say the Broncos want to call him up to the active roster for the first 3 games of the season, and they do exactly that. They bring him up, he plays in the games, he does some special teams, catches a touchdown from Russell Wilson. Great. And then they want to call him up for week 4 this season. So what happens at this point, they can call him up week 4, sign him to the active roster, but then after that 4th game that he's up, they actually have to cut him. They have to subject him to waivers. And at some point during the season, every player becomes subjected to waivers, but somebody like Kendall Hinton specifically would be subject to waivers in this case. So a maximum of 3 times being shuttled up to the active roster every year. Okay. So that's also different. That it was 2 games last year. It was 2 games before. It's 3 games now. So you have the opportunity to do that with all of these guys or any of these guys. And then the other cool thing with the practice squad too, Cody, is this. I think for the Broncos, I think we'll see them use this actually quite a bit. On a given weekend, you can bring your roster up to 55 total players, right? So you have 53, you can call up 2 practice squad guys, and then you have to have 8 inactive players. I know this is a mouthful here. You have to have 8 inactive players every single week, but your practice squad guys can actually count towards a temporary 55-man roster. And if it's, say, a quarterback and an offensive lineman, those are the 2 positions that are given this exception, you can actually carry more players into a game, 47, than you're typically allowed, which is 45. So let's just say the Broncos wanted to call up Josh Johnson, who was re-signed to the practice squad, and have him as a 3rd quarterback for the game. They don't have to have a full list of inactives. If they have Josh Johnson on the list, it's still 8. They don't have to have 9 other guys. So it's kind of a weird, interesting thing, the exceptions that they make for quarterback and offensive linemen. But it's another good rule that the NFL really should have. I still don't understand the game day inactives. It doesn't make sense to me.
I don't either.
But the NFL does it, so I don't get it. But those are that's kind of the most easy way I could explain exactly what these roster exceptions are, because you have them all throughout the season, and you can only use it 3 times. So you want to use Josh Johnson a 4th time, you will have to cut him, and you will have to sign him back to the practice squad. So kind of interesting how it all works, but it's much better now than it was, say, 3 or 4 years ago.
It's crazy to think that's how things were operated by years ago, in a sense. Like, that's like the caveman days in the sense of NFL roster construction. The roster gymnastics that you have to do, I think, are crazy enough as is. But now it's like, what have we been missing as like football fans? What have NFL teams been missing from personnel departments? Like, hey, now we get more of these guys here. I do agree with you. I think it's a great chance to develop and stash players and give them an opportunity to hide and grow and learn the system, which I think this coaching staff's plan is to do just that. But Sayre, thank you so much for all the insight here on the roster construction side of things, practice squad rules, and more here on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. The Broncos will practice one more time on Thursday before having some time off going into next week when the NFL regular season ramps up and practice officially begins in terms of game week. Yes, the Broncos don't play the next Sunday, but they play the following Monday as well here. Monday Night Football against the Seattle Seahawks. I'll be on the road in Seattle covering the game. We'll have complete coverage here, Locked On Broncos. But in the meantime, leading up to the Seattle Seahawks game, guess what? Every single day here on the Locked On Broncos podcast, you get daily Denver Broncos news, content coverage, and more from Sayre, Bedinger, and myself. With that said, we'll see you tomorrow for a brand new episode, Locked On Broncos.